Hamish de Brеттon-Гордон is a retired British Army colonel. He was a commanding officer of UK and NATO's chemical, radiological, biological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to the program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
Reuters reported that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin was begging for a ceasefire on the current front lines in Ukraine. What does it mean?
Well, that's a really interesting comment coming out from Reuters. I think it probably clearly shows that the Russians are getting extended. We know that they have taken a lot of casualties, particularly in the northeast around Kharkiv. We know that last week as well, it was announced that over 500,000 Russian soldiers had been casualties, killed in this war so far. And it's clear that that sort of information is starting to feed back to people in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And that is affecting the support for the illegal Russian invasion. I think also Ukraine is making some real progress of taking out some targets behind the lines, affecting the logistics supply to the front line. Putin appears to have realized that although he's made some small gains recently, it's been at great cost. And as NATO needs to be galvanizing to give Ukraine more weapons and allowing Ukraine to attack targets deep inside Russia, maybe Putin is trying to cut his losses, as it were. However, I don't think, certainly looking from this side of Europe, it seems a pretty hollow offer. And it seems completely out with what the Ukraine president, Zelensky, has said would be acceptable. I think his last comments were that negotiations would happen when the Russians are back to the borders of 2014. And we're a long way from there. So hopefully it is a sign of Russian desperation and realizing that actually they probably can't go much further.
If there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, how can Russian side use this pause in fighting from your perspective?
I think if there is a ceasefire, the Russians presumably want it so that they can regroup and get more men to the front. You know, I can't imagine in any prospect that the Ukrainian government would go for a ceasefire at this particular moment. Things are very finely balanced. Perhaps the only people would benefit from it would be the Russians. So I expect the Russians realize that, you know, as it getting into summertime, with new weaponry on its way, hopefully potentially the F-16 fighter jets are not too far away. Putin thinks he's probably got as far as he can get and would like a ceasefire to regroup. So the only people I expect who would benefit at this stage would be a ceasefire. That is, unless the Russian forces withdraw from their current positions back to the February 2022 lines and also the 2014 lines. So, yeah, a ceasefire at this moment seems pretty illogical from NATO's point of view and also from Ukraine's point of view. But of course, everybody wants to see the stop of useless killing, the stop of civilian casualties as soon as possible. But, you know, it doesn't seem that this offer of a ceasefire has much substance to it at the moment.
More and more Western countries allowed to use Western weapons to strike inside Russia. Could it be the reason why Putin is begging for a ceasefire?
Yeah, I think this might well be behind it because now the UK and some other NATO countries have agreed that Ukraine can strike into Russia. Weapons like Storm Shadow and ATACMS and HIMARS would mean that targets up to about 400 kilometers into Russia could be hit. Now, in that 400 kilometer zone, it's where all the Russian command and control headquarters are. It's where the airfields are, where they're launching a lot of the attacks at cities, towns and cities in Ukraine. And it's where all their logistic hub and support are. So we have already seen some of these deep strikes, the impact that they would have. If the US also allowed Ukraine to use US missiles, which is hugely significant. And Secretary Biden only yesterday suggested that this is very close to being the US giving authority to Kyiv to do that. If that was the case, I think it would make the Russian position very, very difficult. And if, for instance, Ukraine manages to shut the Kursk bridge onto Crimea, although militarily that might not have a huge impact, from a moral perspective, one would hope it would really up the morale of people in Ukraine, and it would be a huge, devastating blow to Putin himself, who sees the Kursk bridge as a very personal project. And I expect him to have a lot of difficult explaining to do in the Kremlin if the Kursk bridge was shut. So, yeah, I agree that perhaps behind Putin's thinking for a ceasefire at the moment is the prospect of all these sophisticated precision weapons being targeted at that zone, sort of 400 kilometers into Russia, which could really stall the Russian war machine at the moment.
The White House considers possible lifting of those restrictions you mentioned about the Western weapons striking inside Russia by Ukraine. If there is a green light from the White House, do you expect a dramatic change of the course of the war due to such decision of the White House?
Well, I think it might well do. I think up to this stage, Ukraine has been fighting with at least one hand behind its back. You know, Russia has been able to attack from all over the place, from deep in Russia and also from in occupied Ukraine itself. So Ukraine not being given the facility to attack Russia, you know, gives it a really distinct military disadvantage. But with the authority now, and seemingly the US about to give agreement too, I think this changes the context quite markedly, because it means that any Russian forces within 400 kilometers of the border, you know, have the potential to be attacked. And that will give Russian commanders some really difficult decisions, which they haven't had to do thus far, and hopefully will allow Ukraine to get on the offensive, to get on the front foot, rather than being purely defensive. So, yeah, I think this could be a very significant part to the war. And as things are finally balanced at the moment, hopefully this authority will turn the balance back in Ukraine's favor.
Let's cover also situation on the ground in the Kharkiv region. Russian troops have not succeeded in creating a buffer zone in the Kharkiv region, according to the British intelligence. What factors played the most significant role in their failure in the Kharkiv region?
Well, I think the Russians have put an awful lot of effort into that area around Kharkiv to try and get a bridgehead and try and create a buffer zone. But very quickly, it would appear the Ukrainian forces have regrouped, and the Russians have suffered tremendous casualties. Even they cannot keep maintaining that level of casualties and also that level of ammunition. It is clear that a lot of the Russian conscripts thrown into this fight are pretty inexperienced. And some of the figures for the level of casualties are absolutely extreme. So I think this was a very significant push by the Russians to try and draw Ukrainian forces from elsewhere on the front line. And basically, it would appear to have failed. And I should think that is a severe blow to those Russian forces in that area, and also to local commanders. In the recent days and weeks, we have seen Putin sack a lot of his very successful generals, and it would appear that there are some pretty inexperienced people now in command. And Russia and Putin, you know, rather like the way that Hitler operated in the Second World War, he just got rid of people who were not successful. But for Putin, he's replacing them with even less experienced people. So the Kharkiv offensive by Russia has been very significant. Ukraine has done a fantastic job to repel it. And I think we're now seeing that with the added advantage that Ukraine can now attack into Russia, Putin and his generals are realizing that actually they are on the back foot now, whereas they've been on the front foot for some time. And hopefully now Ukraine forces can push on with that advantage and start pushing the Russians back.
Also, Ukrainian forces, as you mentioned, have stopped the Russian forces and even are counterattacking in some areas in the Kharkiv region. How could it end? How could this Russian push in the Kharkiv region end for the Russian side, for Kremlin?
Well, hopefully it's going to end badly. And hopefully Ukraine forces will be able to push the Russians right back in that area where they were before the offensive, and also further if possible as well. It's fighting in this sort of, everybody knows how desperate and difficult the fighting is, but a lot of it is around confidence and those people who have the momentum. Now, Russia had a bit of a momentum to begin with, but now they have lost that. And, the severe casualties they've taken must be having an impact on their soldiers and on their generals. And hopefully also now the Russian people realizing quite how many hundreds of thousands of their young men are being sent to their death. So this has the potential, I think, with the additional ability to use sophisticated long-range precision weaponry to attack into Russia, to really make the Russian high command and Putin himself think very carefully where they're going to go next. And once the US gives the green light to allow these weapons to happen, to be used, hopefully we might be talking about a ceasefire in a few weeks or months' time, but right back on the original borders that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament are looking at.
Do you expect the Russian side to try another counteroffensive again, despite the current failures on the ground?
Well, if I purely put my military hat on, of course, they're going to have to. If they don't, really, their campaign is severely affected. So I'm sure they'll be looking to see what they can do. However, Russia is virtually all a conscript army now. The professionals, the experts, have been removed from the battlefield a long time ago. Fighting a maneuver war, these offensives that we've talked about, takes a lot of training, a lot of coordination, and one just doesn't get the feeling that the Russian forces have got that. So to be able to mount a huge offensive elsewhere on the line would seem unlikely at the moment. No doubt they can still attack in local areas and get some force together, but for some major breakthrough, I think this is unlikely. I think the other thing that is highly unlikely, which is worrying a lot of Western leaders, is the almost daily threats of Russia to use tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons. This is something that I hope Western leaders will realize is bluff and bluster. The Russians have been threatening this for the last year and a half since they illegally invaded Ukraine, and it hasn't happened. But I think there are some Western leaders who take too much from that. So, yeah, I think it's going to be difficult for the Russians. And I hope the advantage and the extra munitions and everything else that should be flowing into Ukraine will give the Ukraine forces the impetus to be able to push the Russians back now.
You mentioned about Russia's nuclear drills. In one of your interviews for Times Radio, you said that there were a little bit poorly organized. What is your take on the quality of such nuclear drills?
Well, absolutely. The Russians posted some nuclear drills only last week of using Iskander missiles and doing drills near the Ukraine border. Actually, when you look closely at those videos, those Iskander missiles were not nuclear missiles. They were conventional ones, which is why on the videos they were all blurred. It's quite common knowledge that Russia has had to take a lot of nuclear warheads off their Iskander missiles to use them conventionally as they run out. But when you look closer at those Russian nuclear forces operating, they seem to be very, very poorly trained, very poorly disciplined, and actually not even using nuclear warheads on their missiles. So again, I think it is part of Russian bluff and bluster, and if they really think that people in Ukraine in the West are fooled by it, then they are fools themselves. So I think we've discussed before that actually the Russian battlefield tactical nuclear weapons are probably pretty much unusable because they have to get so close to Ukraine to do it. And of course, Ukraine now has the long-range precision missiles that would be able to stop those nuclear weapons being launched anyway. So I think in sum, I'd go back to my early point that the Russian nuclear threat, the battlefield threat, I think is complete bluff and bluster. And particularly Western leaders should take it as such. And hopefully the civilian population in Ukraine will not be too perturbed by it, because I really don't think the Russians would or can actually use these weapons in Ukraine.
German newspaper Bild reported that NATO was considering a possible no-fly zone over the western part of Ukraine. What is your take on that idea? Don't you think that it's a half-hearted measure?
Well, I think the basis of the idea is good. I cannot see why NATO jets and NATO air defense cannot shoot down Russian missiles that are fired at Ukrainian cities. After all, we did that to Iranian missiles being fired at Israeli cities. So I think the precedent has sort of been set. Maybe just having it over the Western area might just be a start. And actually, for practical reasons, might be the easiest thing that NATO could do at the moment. But I think all things need to be considered, because I see no difference of a Russian missile being fired at a Ukrainian city to an Iranian one being fired at an Israeli city. They're all aimed to kill and injure civilians. And I think it is NATO's job to try and prevent that. And certainly in the West, with the way that NATO forces are currently positioned, they could probably do that. But I'm sure NATO will also be considering all eventualities. President Macron has talked about more NATO soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. A few others have dismissed this, but it must be a potential option. And I think one of the key things one has to do in warfare is keep your enemy guessing. It's unhelpful when Western leaders say that they will not put troops into Ukraine, because that really hands the advantage back to Putin. So I applaud NATO countries suggesting that they'll put a no-fly zone over the West, but I would like to see that extended very much more. But it is a start, and it's a good move, I think.
And what could be the next? You said that it could be only a start, but where it go next? It could go next.
Well, if in theory NATO forces are prepared to shoot down missiles near the western border, and that is successful, then in order to prevent further civilian casualties in Ukraine, one would like to see that potentially extended. And certainly with the range of weaponry that NATO has, they could extend it a bit further. So I think we'll have to wait and see. NATO has been very slow to act, and Western countries have been very slow to give Ukraine the sophisticated weaponry that it needs. If tanks had been available straight away, if fighter jets had been available straight away, I'd expect we'd be in a very different position. Now, hopefully NATO has learned from that. And hopefully NATO has also learned that it needs to keep the Russians and keep Putin guessing. It's been rather too obvious hitherto on what it's prepared to do. So I think it will be planning to have a much wider impact into Ukraine. The hope is that the capabilities that are flowing into Ukraine now And the fact that the Russian forces look as though they've reached their culminating point, being exhausted in sort of civilian speak, means that Ukraine can get on the offensive, get on the front foot itself. But NATO must be prepared to support Ukraine even more, because the last thing that anybody wants is a wider war in Europe. And the only way to prevent that is to make sure that Ukraine prevails and pushes the Russians back whence they came.
Former US President Donald Trump said that he would have bombed Moscow in case of Russia's invasion during his presidency. What is your take on such a military option?
Well, it's one has to take what Mr. Trump says sometimes with what we call a pinch of salt. He says an awful lot of things. Some of them are possible, some of them are not. I think bombing Moscow in the early days would have been incredibly difficult, even for the Americans, and potentially would have expanded the war much more quickly and much more widely in Europe. However, I do agree with the sentiment. I do agree that NATO should not take anything off the table. Putin should be aware that he just can't act and do whatever he likes without severe consequences. So the sentiment is sort of right. The practicalities of bombing Moscow from Europe is a challenge, but it's not impossible. But I think at this stage of the conflict, it would not really change the situation here. It would probably create a third world war rather than stop it. But the key thing is to keep the Russians guessing and give Ukraine everything it can to push the Russians back whence they came.
Thank you, Colonel Hemish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.